Afternoon, everyone. So I'm Managing Director of Off-Highway Research, and this year we undertook what is probably our biggest and most ambitious study ever on the global mobile crane market. We have a stand out here, and we have a copy of the report if you'd like to come and leaf through it. It's about 250 pages. So obviously I can only give you the headlines here. In general, my feeling about market presentations is that they should be like cricket matches. They should last at least 6 hours, but preferably 5 days. Unfortunately, Alex has only given me 20 minutes, but because of my presentation style, it will feel like 5 days. So let's get it. Off-Highway Research, as Alex said in the introduction, is a specialist in international market research, focused very tightly on the construction equipment business. We're the largest consultant of its type in the world, formed in 1981, and for the last 10 years we've been owned by KHL Group, which of course is the organiser of this event and the publisher of Crane Briefing. So with our own offices and our own staff, we have a presence in all the strategic markets around the world, but we also benefit very greatly from the parent company's footprint and also from all the knowledge that we have in-house within the group. So what's happening in the global mobile crane market? That's the last 5 years. Not really looking great, is it? Sales peaked, strangely you might think, at the start of the pandemic, and the market has more or less halved since then. But bear in mind we are talking about the global situation. The collapse has been entirely due to what's happened in the Chinese market. There was a brief period of stimulus spending in 2020 and 2021, and as with the previous stimulus spending in 2010 and 2011, that burned very, very briefly, albeit very brightly. So that passed quite quickly, and at the same time you've had the collapse of the Chinese real estate sector, which continues to be problematic for the Chinese market and will be for some time, unfortunately. So from the point of view of looking at this global market, it's quite useful to think about China as kind of doing its own thing, because it's got different drivers, things are happening at a different pace, and the cycle is very different there, and the rest of the world. So, okay, this is what's happened in China. It's been a pretty horrible market downturn, which is only just now turning around. However, much smaller in unit terms, but in terms of growth, the world excluding China has had an extremely strong 5 years. Few things have dropped off this chart, but just to be clear, we're talking about 4 crane types here. Yellow is truck cranes, grey is lattice boom crawler cranes, orange is rough terrain cranes, and the one that's dropped off in red is all-terrain cranes. So the makeup of global markets, again, is very, very different depending on whether you look at China or not. So yes, the market, the global market, is very much dominated by truck cranes if you include China. Even if you take China out, truck cranes are still the biggest type in unit terms. That is something that's changed quite recently. And it's purely because, and we'll come on to this in more depth, that as the Chinese market has collapsed, the OEMs in China have pushed very, very hard on exports, really as a matter of survival. We've seen many emerging markets around the world really take off in terms of the number of cranes that are sold. Obviously the core product, the high volume product in China is truck cranes, and that's been the key sort of spearhead product that's been sold in these other markets, but it is across all 4 types. So let's talk about the relative size of markets. What we've got here in this chart is in red, if you consider the size of the market in dollar terms, and in grey in unit terms. So you see immediately that there is quite an imbalance in a market like China particularly, where you have this huge volume of sales, even at the moment with the market quite depressed. But because they're quite small, quite low capacity cranes, the value of that market is not particularly high. But then if you look across Europe, North America, Japan, India, South America, in unit terms they're quite similar really in size, but you see that Europe and North America are much more valuable in dollar terms, much more attractive markets, partly because there's a focus on inherently more expensive crane types or inherently higher technology, but also because you tend to get a little bit more relatively in the high capacity classes. The really interesting one though is these rest of the world markets, which in the context of this presentation is everywhere that's not specifically named. And that whole region has grown to be enormously important, both in unit and in dollar terms. Just a very quick look at how the market breaks down in terms of lifting capacity. So you see the light green bar represents the proportion of cranes that are 50 tons or less. So you see essentially that most cranes that are sold around the world are quite small cranes. Almost 80% of the market globally is 100 tons or less. And you obviously have, above that sort of capacity, you tend to get the all-terrain cranes coming in much more, where rough terrain cranes and truck cranes can't really get any bigger. It's a little bit hard to see on this, but although you kind of got this mass market which sort of dominates the picture, the heavy lift market is very significant, comfortably more than 1,000 cranes per year. Pretty much dominated by all-terrain cranes, but obviously a lot of very large crawler cranes in that market as well. This is one of the things that I hope we'll take away from this, is that the market has changed a lot in the last 4 years. It's probably changed more in terms of the volume of sales and the competitive landscape than this industry has ever seen before. We've heard a lot about change throughout the day today, and it's something that I think people are instinctively a little bit scared of because it's not what they're used to. But change is huge, huge opportunity. And I think one of the things that we found writing this report is that, yesterday was yesterday, fine, that's not going to happen again, get used to it and move on. But as the market shifts, as buying patterns shift, there will be enormous opportunities wherever you are in this industry, whether you're an OEM or a component supplier, whether you're a fleet owner, whether you're active in the aftermarket, there's a lot that is changing very quickly in this industry. Some companies will fall by the wayside as a result, but those that see the trend coming, to pick up on the theme that we've just been hearing about, will prosper hugely. So just a couple of quick headlines from that. The Chinese market dynamic has been quite significant. It is a high volume market, but it's perhaps not a very attractive one. It's very, very hard to do business. There are 3 very large, very dominant suppliers there, which really have a very tough competitive relationship with each other. Most other markets have grown in the last 5 years. Obviously in 2020 the market was unnaturally low because pandemic, supply chains, all those sort of things. But markets have more or less gone back to a natural level now, I would say. The ones that have really taken off and exceeded what might have been expected are the emerging markets. And that really is a function of what some of the major OEMs in China have done, partly chosen to do, but to some extent have had to do to survive the difficult conditions they're feeling at home. So let's talk about the competitive landscape and how that's changed. Within our report, we have all these market shares by OEM and by crane type, and it's not really the environment to get into all of that. So I'm just talking about, if you look at a market and the cranes that are sold there, where are they made? So Europe, no surprise, most of them are from the traditional suppliers manufacturing in Germany and Austria as well, in Liebherr's case, and a few other smaller suppliers. I think the significant thing there is that 5% of cranes sold in Europe from China. I'm sure you all read in Construction Briefing last week about the the complaint that's been launched. Dean just mentioned it in the earlier presentation. So you can kind of understand why, with all the compliance and the cost that European manufacturers have, why there is some disquiet about much cheaper products coming in from China. Not wishing to second guess what those tariffs will be or how things will work out, because we've got the investigation, the decision, the appeal on the appeal. It'll take a couple of years. But if you look at what's happened in the UK with the excavator anti-dumping case, and also in Europe around access platforms, probably I would think what we're going to end up with is tariffs of between 20 and 50% on Chinese cranes. You know, ballpark figure, and not wishing to short circuit 3 years of due process, but that's probably about what the outcome will be. North America. For those of you who were in the sweepstake this morning, you'll have noticed that the word tariff was mentioned within 6 minutes. So if you had 6 minutes in the tariff sweepstake, drinks are on you this evening. The issue with North America particularly is about 70% of cranes that are sold in that market are imported, so tariffs will have a significant impact. But even for US-made cranes, and I'll come on to this, there will be very, very significant impacts on cost because of the foreign content in cranes. And in Japan is almost entirely served by the Japanese OEMs, and that 5% is basically all-terrain cranes over 100 tons. So next, just looking at a couple of other markets. This chart on China took us a long time to draw, believe me. You know, there was a time, maybe going back, I don't know, until about 15 years ago, where there were sales of cranes manufactured in other parts of the world in China. But in that time, there's been phenomenal technological development among the indigenous OEMs, and they're producing very, very large, very impressive heavy lift cranes of their own, and there simply isn't space for any other manufacturers there. And then if you look at the emerging markets, which, as I said, have been a real interesting area over the last 4 years, you know, historically that pie would have been shared a lot more evenly. But with the focus on exports from the three big Chinese OEMs in particular, you've really seen a huge change in the competitive landscape in that part of the world. The traditional suppliers, I'd imagine, are feeling very, very squeezed there. So that emerging market growth has been phenomenal. Just over that 5-year period, 259%, equivalent to about 30% per year. You know, no one, notwithstanding the fact that as soon as we kind of got over the initial lockdowns, there was a huge boom in all sorts of aspects of the world economy. Nothing really boomed quite like the crane markets in those parts of the world. You know, clearly it's not sustainable. We feel that sales are probably more or less topped out now. And so there is a question, again, for the Chinese OEMs that have relied on these markets for their volumes and actually particularly for their profits about where you go next. So that, you know, there could be some interesting consequences there. But it also kind of, you know, there's some interesting things to draw out of that. There have never been as many cranes in the world as there are today. You know, absolutely, undoubtedly, with the kind of sales volumes that we've seen. So if you're in the aftermarket in any way whatsoever, you know, if that's not an opportunity, I really would like to know what one is. The key product has been truck cranes, as I alluded to before, both in terms of the volume and the percentage growth. But there's actually been quite strong growth in rough terrain cranes, again, largely from the Chinese manufacturers. And that's, you know, again, not particularly expected, because rough terrain cranes are not a product which really sell in China. So these products which have been developed, you know, within China are selling in these big end markets without having, you know, the domestic market to support that. So the competitive landscape, it has changed a lot. You saw from the previous pies on the developed markets that there hasn't really been that much impact from Chinese OEMs in developed markets. but they absolutely dominate in emerging markets now, particularly in those areas where there's a strong grounding in the domestic market of truck cranes and lattice boom crawler cranes. You know, and if you're, you know, from Germany and you've been making all-terrain cranes for 40 years, you might think, okay, I'm fine. You know, you're probably not. There are a lot of all-terrain cranes manufactured and sold in China now, going up to extremely high capacities. It's become a very important crane type, and again, that is an important export product. And as I said, strong in rough terrain cranes without any real tradition there. Yes, we've obviously touched on some of these points. I think the key point to bear in mind in these emerging markets is one of the reasons there has been an acceleration is, you know, to put it bluntly, price. It was, you know, again, yesterday, which isn't going to happen again, it was always the case that a lot of emerging markets were served by used cranes coming out of rental fleets in Europe, North America and Japan. But now new cranes of the same capacity can be bought for less than the used crane. That obviously has huge implications for fleet owners. You know, what is your disposal route? What is your expectation on residual value? If you've not thought about this, or you've not felt it yet, it's probably something to give a bit of thought to. There are other things that have helped the Chinese OEMs. They're a little bit more relaxed in commercial terms. But I think the other thing that, you know, notwithstanding the fact how big that boom has been, I think you have to accept that there are positives for everyone in the market, because that huge that market has been stimulated by the availability of these cranes, and that brings all sorts of opportunities, again, mainly in aftermarket areas. I think the thing to mention on that is that the customers of Chinese cranes are not normally particularly loyal and not normally particularly keen on buying genuine parts. So if you're in a space that sort of serves and services cranes, there may be an opportunity there. But yes, the implications, I mean, for OEMs, how do you compete? I think you have to do something different. You can't really compete on price. Obviously, these anti-dumping things that are going on do point to advantages that Chinese OEMs have that traditional suppliers don't have, because land is cheap, steel's cheap, energy's cheap, labour's cheap, all these things. In markets where there's a crane industry, a manufacturing industry to protect, there probably will be anti-dumping hearings. Obviously Europe just now, there's been one going on in India for a couple of years now. But in most markets, most of these emerging markets, cheap cranes are good news. You know, it's not eroding an existing manufacturing business. So it's happy days. So I think there's a question for traditional OEMs of what do you do about this competition? Price is not a battleground for you anymore. You know, you have to be thinking about smarter ways to compete, or other areas, or what's your niche, what's your speciality. There is also a question about what happens when the market becomes saturated. I think it's more of an existential threat for the Chinese OEMs. As I said, these exports have happened really as a driver of survival for many of these OEMs, but the profits that they're getting in overseas markets have generally been a lot better than they get at home, where competition is brutal, absolutely brutal. And I think as market conditions get tighter in, you know, wherever it may be, in Indonesia or in the Middle East or wherever, I think there's a risk that the pricing could become cutthroat and could become quite damaging for those OEMs that have done so much to stimulate demand. And as I said, you know, there's an issue for fleet owners. What is your disposal route? You know, what does your balance sheet look like? You have these cranes on your balance sheet. What's your depreciation policy? How are you marking them to market? Assumptions that you may have that were perfectly okay 5 years ago may not be okay anymore. Yeah, so look at your residual values. So yes, it's as I said, it's any conference this year. It is obligatory to talk about tariffs. This is something that we've looked at quite a lot in off-highway research this year. It's something we've done a lot of efforts, done a lot of work in modelling. So I'm just going to take you through some aspects of that and what it means for the crane industry, predominantly in the US, but it is something I feel will resonate around the world. In April, we had the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, which set a tariff on goods based on the country of origin. What we've had in August is these Section 232 tariffs, which affect what are described as steel-derived products. That's defined by the HS code, the tariff code, and so it covers pretty much all construction equipment and, by extension, quite a lot of components. And the issue here, or one of the points here, is that the tariff is a flat 50% on the value of steel, regardless of the country of origin. And the remaining content, whatever it is taxed based on that April tariff. So the thing is with cranes, obviously there's a very, very high value steel content. I'm taking you through the assumptions that we've made. If you assume 90%, then that crane or that component, when it lands in the US, most of the tariff, that 90% steel content is going to have about a 45% tariff, regardless of where it came from. So the remaining bit, yes, if you're a more friendly country, it might be 10%. If you're less friendly, it's 30%. But with these steel tariffs dominating, who cares? Because there's very, very little difference between the overall tariff paid on that crane, whether you're a friendly, cuddly trade partner or one of the big bad trade partners. So that is the first very important point to bear in mind. It will probably steer customers towards lower cost cranes. And in fact, a month or two ago, there was a letter from a major crane owner in the US published in Construction Briefing. I'd encourage you to look that up, which does discuss in more detail what the consequences of that are. And it probably wasn't what the administration intended. So there are impacts for both domestic and overseas producers. And I do want to stress that it's not just imported cranes that will be hit by a price increase. For foreign producers, yes, obviously these direct tariffs, they're going to be in the range of 45 to 50%. They're probably not passing on all those costs at the moment, but sooner or later they will all hit. But for domestic producers, there are going to be issues, and there are going to be very significant issues. Again, I do agree with the previous point that these are probably phasing in, but sooner or later you have to take the hit and you have to pass these costs on. Your supply base as a crane manufacturer is going to be global, absolutely. And you're going to be paying a tariff of, again, around 45 to 50% on the components that you're importing. But even your American components are going to have foreign content from further down the supply chain. So you may be dealing with a guy down the road, but they're going to be saying, yeah, actually we need to put 20% on that, perfectly legitimately. So the impacts depend on the assumptions, but it's a relief when the previous speaker says something you agree with. But I would say that a made in America product is probably going to be of the order of 25% more expensive when all these tariffs are in place, when inventory is out of the system and everything is passed on. So if you take those increases and look at applying them to where the cranes come from, what you come out with is the amount of money spent on cranes last year, when these tariffs are fully in place, will buy about 26% fewer cranes. There's no direct correlation by saying price does this, so sales do that. But clearly the kind of costs that are involved have to be passed on. And it seems extremely likely that the market will dip as a result of this. And again, probably an unintended consequence that buyers will be driven to lower cost cranes. Other things to bear in mind, think about your machine residual values. You're buying a crane, you've got to pay anywhere between another 20 and 45% on that. that's not adding value. That is tax. That money goes to the government. So previously, if you bought a $1 million crane, you know, plucking numbers out of the air, but just to illustrate, if you bought a $1 million crane, you looked after it really well, and after 10 years, you could expect to sell it for $500,000. You know, great, fine. Now that same crane will cost 1.45, maybe 1.5 million, and your bookkeeping standards, your depreciation curve says, well, after 10 years, I want to get half the value, I want to get $750,000 for it. You know, bad luck. You know, if you think that, that's kind of a you problem, because the value of a used crane is, you know, not strictly speaking, but it is more or less a world price. So you're, instead of having a 50% residual value, you probably only got a third of that, of what you paid as the residual value. And yeah, you know, if you have big fleets, you have these cranes on your balance sheet, you could have quite interesting issues coming down the line if you don't change your accounting policies. So anyway, just to wrap up, I want to talk about the forecast. Globally, the market will probably bottom out this year, basically because China will pick up. It will be a pretty slow recovery. And then if you look at the rest of the world, we think markets will, you know, pretty much at the top and will decline slightly in the years to come. I've talked a lot about China, so I've just put up a graph here of how sales have developed over the years and how we see our forecast. As I said, the market's probably bottoming out this year. I mean, I think the thing to say about the crane market in China is it is just absolutely mental. You know, there's no sanity to it. It kind of shoots up when stimulus spending comes in, or when big infrastructure projects come online. They tend to be executed very quickly, and then it is very prone to collapse. So it's very, very hard to say, you know, what is a normal, natural, steady state for the Chinese market. Whatever normal might be, it'll probably get there in the next 5 years. But you know, pity my team in Beijing who have to turn in a forecast for the Chinese market because you know, who knows, the government just pressed the big red stimulus button, and all of a sudden, instead of a 20,000 crane market, it's 50,000. So the world, excluding China, as I said, has probably topped out this year. You know, we're reasonably optimistic that we'll enter a fairly shallow decline. We do have concerns around that. Of course, we do feel that the emerging markets are pretty saturated, and that will contribute to the cool down. But the economic conditions that have driven those crane sales, you know, we think are more or less still there. So we don't really expect a crash. And most developed markets, we think will stay fairly strong. As we heard this morning in Maurice's presentation, a lot of the parts of construction that are very helpful for the crane market do have some of the better outlooks. So the infrastructure markets in Europe and North America in particular are quite strong. In North America, you also have the boom of data center construction, and also all the power infrastructure that goes along with that. So, you know, taking a step back from the craziness of the last few years, we are reasonably confident about the markets, but there is the obvious risk in North America that the situation with tariffs could be kind of quite disruptive and quite damaging, particularly in the next year or two. So, as I said, this comes from a major report that we've published this year. We have a table out in the networking area, and we have copies in paper and on an iPad. So if you'd like to come by and leaf through, be very welcome, obviously, if you bring the purchase order with you, but we will accept browsers as well. So with that, I'll hand back to Alex. I'll be pleased to take any easy questions.